I 12 or 14 hours of this. I think we're the only podcast that's covered it in details, in depth like this. So the question I have to all of you is, did you like the show? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? Because I'm always interested, because you guys are paying for this, what you're interested in and what you're not. So if you like the show, let us know. Send us an email at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Let us know what you liked about the show, what you didn't like about the show, what you thought we should have included. And I know that people are going to bring up Russell Buffalino, because at one point he was overseeing the Genovese crime family, and it was between the time period before Vinnie Gigante took over and Vito Genovese died. There was a couple of months where they did sort of have a ruling panel, but Russell Buffalino did sort of mitigate everything and sort of took control of the family in terms of he made the decisions. He let guys on the panel sort of do their thing, but he had the final say, and they only did that until they could induct somebody as the official boss of the family. So if you thought I forgot that, I didn't. I just didn't bring it up because there's really not a whole lot to talk about. It's just that's the case. But that shows you the power that Russell Buffalino had. So we know how Vincent Gigante came up. We know from just history that Vincent Gigante was never caught on a single wiretap except one, where he appeared to be telling his wife he loved her. And he appeared somewhat normal on that wiretap, but it wasn't enough for the feds to do anything. The Genovese crime family was once again the most powerful mafia family in New York City. This is where the argument sort of begins. Some have claimed that John Gotti was the boss of bosses, and that's 100% not true. The reality is, depending on who you talk to, people will say that John Gotti was afraid of nobody. But people will also say that John Gotti was terrified of Vincent Gigante. I don't know what the truth was. I'm not John Gotti. I would tend to think that because of his bravado, because of his personality, he probably didn't give a fuck what anybody thought. But there are some signs that would lead me to believe that I'm not going to use scared, because I don't think he was ever scared of anybody. But I think the appropriate word to use here is probably mindful of who he was dealing with, because he actually once, at one point, he bragged to Vinnie Gigante that he inducted his own son, John Jr. And it's been said that Vincent Gigante shook his head and just said, "Why would you even do that to your son? Like, I'm sorry to hear that. Why would you do that?" That's just the difference between the two men. The Chin was not a fan of John Gotti Jr. at all. Didn't like him, didn't like the fact that he was in, and I've been told by multiple people that the Chin refused to even recognize Junior as a boss under any circumstance. And the other thing is this, is that John Gotti put a ruling panel into the Gambino crime family. Junior was not the boss on his own. He was on a panel of people. Because of his name, he's going to get the sort of notoriety with that. But he was on a panel with like 4 other people. So he never really had the family all on his own. There were other people involved. Now, at some point, did that change? Yes. But for the most part, there was a ruling panel. So 1985, 1986 was a huge year, not just for the Mafia, but for a lot of different crime families. Not only were the heads of the 5 families essentially raping the housing authority for some $150 million a year, but now they controlled every single mixer that was dumping concrete in the city of New York. Vinnie Gigante ran his family like a well-oiled machine. John Gotti was caught repeatedly on wiretaps making fun of Vinnie Gigante, and it kind of blew John's mind that any man could lower himself to acting like half a retard on the city streets for everybody to see. Because Vinnie Gigante would walk up and down Houston Street. Now, where I live in Manhattan, Houston Street is like 10 steps from me. I'm very close to Houston. Houston is a big thoroughfare through businesses. That's not like a side street. This is a major fucking street. There's hundreds of people on the street. So imagine Vinnie Gigante walking up and down Houston in a bathrobe, muttering to himself. That, in and of itself. But Gigante was so convincing that half of his own crime family didn't know whether he was legitimately fucking crazy or not. the chin changed the way his family operated. Tony Salerno was completely the front boss, and Vincent Gigante did not allow anybody to mention his name under any circumstances, as we mentioned in the Q&A. If they did, they were going to be killed. Vinnie also didn't demote captains. In a conversation, he is alleged to have said about 2 captains who are having a beef, "We don't break captains, we kill them." That should tell you the demeanor that Gigante had. He had a lot of the same traits that Vito Genovese did, but he was able to sit back and also negotiate. Whereas Vito Genovese was kind of somebody who didn't want to negotiate. It was his word, and that was final. Gigante was a little different. He was a lot like Luciano in the sense, too, where he felt like there was more than enough money to go around, and it didn't make any sense to him arguing over nonsense. Vincent had his man in Philadelphia, Nicky Scarfo, and now he was getting kickbacks of the action in Atlantic City. It's something New York bosses wanted, but Genovese was able to do. There's a difference. Everybody wanted to do it. Vinnie Gigante was able to do it. It wouldn't take long before Nicky Scarfo became a huge fucking problem. Ends up going on a killing spree. And then John Gotti sort of steps in and begins to court Nicky Scarfo. As Gotti had sort of designs on his own about encroaching into New Jersey, which created a serious backlash in Philadelphia. Gotti, for some reason, thought he controlled everything and thought he could just do whatever the fuck he wanted. Gigante saw the issues in Philadelphia, heard grumblings about Scarfo and Gotti meeting together. As long as Gigante was getting a kickback from Atlantic City, he really didn't give a fuck, but he does the smart thing and he steps out of the picture and says, you know what? I'm done with this. Gotti would actually never get what he wanted, what he was seeking. And with Nicky, he had like a fucking mimic, a fucking puppet. Nicky was enamored with John Gotti. And while Nicky was more of a violent gangster, than Gotti was. That's just the truth. I mean, listen, Gotti was violent. He didn't fuck around. Nicky took that to a whole nother fucking level. At any rate, with everything going smoothly, there were serious things coming for everybody. You had Gaspipe, you had Castellano, Angelo Rogerio, the commission case, and so much more. And I'm probably going to do this a little bit out of order. But all of these things we're going to talk about happened in a relatively short period of time. I don't want to get into I don't want to get into the entire Castellano thing again, because obviously we've talked about it ad nauseum. And when we talk about the Gambino crime family, we are going to talk about the Castellano hit in depth. But I want to just save that for the Gambino series when we do it. But we have to talk about Angelo Rogerio for a second, because this is going to transcend a lot of different things. Angelo Rogerio created a big mess for himself and for the Gambino crime family. We all know that one of the big problems that Paul Castellano was going to face down the line was narcotics. Not just that, but you had, Roy DeMeo and his crew of Jolly Jesters. Rogerio's brother, Salvatore Rogerio, was a huge narcotics distributor. His brother would die in a plane crash, which sort of thrust Angelo Rogerio into the narcotics trade. There was too much money for Rogerio to give it up. He also needed to tie up all of his brother's loose ends. At the same time that his brother was killed, he had been a fugitive as well. So Sal Rogerio he was basically wanted by the FBI and everybody else, and he was moving around for years. He dies in a plane crash, and immediately Angelo has, are you going to give up his drug routes? Are you going to, give up all of his contacts? There's just too much fucking money to lose. Mainly Rogerio had two problems. We're talking about Angelo. He needed to figure out how to hide the money and how to hide the fact that he had been helping his brother, because if he gets caught helping a fugitive, he's going to go to prison. But Angelo's problem, almost from fucking day one. See, a lot of people think that Angelo got caught on tapes, and he did, and that is true. But they were well on to Angelo from day one. This wasn't just all of a sudden they said, oh, we caught Angelo on tapes talking about narcotics. They almost hit him from day one. From fucking day one. His mouth was so fucking bad. The feds already knew everything. They were sitting outside of his house. They saw the traffic. They picking up wiretaps. which is how they began to build a case. Now, that case wouldn't come along till 2.5, 3 years later, but that's how deep this case was. That's how bad this case was. I think sometimes people have a tendency to think, well, he just got caught selling a little dope here and there, and it was just bad because they were already taping him and he was bad-mouthing everybody. But this goes way back. This wasn't just and I'm going to use a reference point. This wasn't just like 1986. They decided to tap him because he's with Gotti and they hear this shit. They were already on to Rogerio for a long, long time because they suspected that he was helping his brother Sal. Once Sal dies, it's a money grab and everybody starts going crazy. And in fact, his family in-laws, Sal's wife, her family was giving up everything about Sal to the government. So Rogerio's fucked from day one. And which is going to lead me to say, once we do the Gambino thing, is how the fuck is it they don't kill Rogerio? So, what we have is, it wasn't until, like I said, Salvatore Rogerio was killed in a plane crash. That's when the narcotic shit began. It wasn't way before, it wasn't way after, it was right after that. In any event, Rogerio would run his mouth and he would end up getting himself and a lot of other people indicted. Gotti, who was the leader of that crew, played stupid like he didn't know anything. Meanwhile, Castellano was infuriated. And again, I don't want to go into the entire thing because it's another family's problem and it's not specifically dealing with the Genovese family. But I have to bring up Angelo because one move would lead to Gigante and Casso to semi-declare war on John Gotti and the Gambino crime family. As a result of those tapes, Angelo basically was refusing to give those tapes over to Castellano, but what he didn't know was Castellano already had copies of the tapes. He knew what was said. He was infuriated, and he wanted to see what Neil Della Croce was going to do, and Della Croce supports Rogerio by stalling. And I think he did because he knew what the consequences were going to be. Ultimately, Della Croce would die, which would force Gotti to make an executive decision, which we all know he does, and Paul gets killed. And we'll go into more details on that on the Gambino show. Paul being killed sent reverberations all over the mob. Number one, it was a brazen hit in front of like a ton of different people. Neither Gotti nor Gravano were ever at the crime scene. That's one of the biggest lies that Sammy Gravano tells. And he tells it because he had to put Gotti at the scene of a crime in order to get him indicted for the Paul Castellano murder. Neither were there at all. They were not there. They didn't drive by. They didn't sit there and watch. They weren't even there. That hit infuriated the commission. It wasn't a sanctioned hit, but it didn't stop Gotti from ordering Frankie DeCicco to sort of send out feelers with other crime families to see if they would go along with it. And one of the people that they felt out was Gaspipe Casso, who, according to people that were around at the time, acknowledged that he wouldn't interfere whatsoever. But it really didn't matter at the end of the day because Casso was about to have issues with the entire Gambino crime family anyway. According to history, Gigante was irate that John Gotti killed Paul Castellano, and he wanted John Gotti dead for doing it. A lot of the reason wasn't because Paul Castellano was so well liked, but it fucked up business between the Gambino and Genovese crime family. And Vincent had a good deal with Paul, especially with the garment district and some other things. And I think the fear was, okay, Gotti did this. It's going to bring a ton of heat to the mob. All of our rackets are going to get fucking crushed. And I may not be able to have the same sort of business agreement that I had prior to that. And I think we can all understand that. I think the biggest concern was the fact that it was so public and law enforcement was going to go fucking nuts, which they did. Not to mention Vinnie the Chin was on record with telling a captain that there were too many civilians in the street and it went against everything that he believed in personally, meaning you don't kill a guy with bystanders. It was reckless. You could have killed an innocent person. That was another thing he didn't like. Many over the years have speculated that the Chin moved on John Gotti, and that's why Frankie DeCicco got killed in the bomb. That was allegedly meant for John Gotti, and none of that is true. That has been misreported for years. Angelo Rogerio, as we know, was moving drugs, and he and Gaspipe never really liked each other from the get-go. Gaspipe wasn't afraid to put it out there, and he often did, that he felt Rogerio was a fucking big mouth and an idiot. Obviously, Rogerio hears the things that Casso is saying, and he's not too thrilled. And it also didn't help that Gaspipe was beginning to encroach on Rogerio's drug turf. Rogerio then reacts. He hires Jimmy Heidel, who was the nephew of Danny Marino, who at the time was a captain in the Gambino crime family. He hires him to kill Gaspipe Casso. Heidel sought Casso, catches up to him, shoots him several times, but Casso ends up living. It was a huge fucking mistake. Then what Casso would do was he would use the Mafia cops Stephen Caracappa and Louis Lepolito to track down Jimmy Heidel. Heidel would be kidnapped and tortured for days by Casso before giving up Angelo Rogerio as the man who hired him. Casso would then kill Heidel, and the game was on. It would have been a Mafia crime, and it was, for Rogerio to order the death of another made guy within another crime family without it being sanctioned. Whether Gotti knew, whether Gotti didn't know, whether he gave permission or whether he didn't, I have no idea. I would speculate that if Gotti hadn't known or hadn't have at least nodded and said, do your thing, the likelihood is that Gotti would have killed Rogerio for that because it started a lot of shit. It would have been enough to sanction the hit on Gotti and Rogerio, and Gotti would have known allowing Rogerio to do that would seal his fate as well. So that ought to tell you that, and I'm not knocking the guy, but it's John Gotti often broke every single fucking rule. He didn't care. And I think that's why he didn't have the respect of a lot of his contemporaries. That's another thing. And listen, the guy by design did whatever he wanted. He was a gangster. He did what he fucking wanted. But there are fucking rules. And he just lived his life the way he wanted to. So, like I said, just Rogerio, attempting to kill Casso, should have been a death sentence. For Gotti allowing it and doing nothing about it, and even Rogerio attempting it should have gotten Rogerio killed. With Gigante already furious over the killing of Castellano, if he had any sort of desire to just let it go, that went right out the fucking window. Casso was hell-bent on killing everybody involved, and his main target was Angelo Rogerio. But Rogerio's life is likely saved because of the indictments and because he was laying low. And the Chin, who could have put a stop to all of this, says, nope, you're not going to do this. It's going to create a war. Let it go, because Rogerio effectively starts it. He broke Cosa Nostra rules. Therefore, Vinnie Gigante is not going to get involved, and he's probably going to look at Casso and go, whatever you got to do, you got to do. At that point, he was done. And what Casso does, he begins to kill the Gambinos in an eye for an eye. Frankie DeChico was killed in a car bomb on April 13th of 1986. It's been said that it was under orders of Vinnie Gigante, but I've never believed that to be the case. I think it was Gaspipe Casso acting an eye for an eye, and any of Gigante's input, if any at all, would have been, to turn to look the other direction when it happened. If anything at all. Gigante, by proxy, never met with anybody. And anybody who speculated that Casso met with Gigante over that, it just isn't accurate. It's not the way that Gigante sort of operated. I just think that Gigante turned his head and looked the other way. Casso would later testify that it was exactly as I've just said. It was an eye for an eye. Kill Gotti, kill his subordinates. And most of it was because Casso knew that Gotti knew Rogerio was behind it and did nothing to stop it and did nothing to handle it. In the streets, that's not an honorable thing. Gotti, for a lot of his standards, lived by his own rules. By the rules, Rogerio should have been killed for the drugs thing. He wasn't. By the streets, Rogerio should have been killed for the Casso thing. He wasn't. He got shelved. Any other boss would have killed Rogerio in 10 fucking seconds. What we can say about Gotti was that he was loyal to Rogerio, completely loyal to him. But the same sort of treatment wasn't designed for everybody. In response, Gotti did nothing in retaliation. Nothing, zero. It wouldn't be the first time that Gotti didn't avenge the murder of one of his own. Bobby Borriello got whacked on orders of Gaspipe Casso some years later. And John Gotti Sr. and John Gotti Jr. did fucking nothing. Nothing. I don't know what the reasons are for that. So much for being loyal to somebody you supposedly love. Borriello was killed in response for his attempt to kill a Genovese crime family member without permission from the commission. So once again, we have another Gambino guy not going by the rules and just doing what the fuck he wanted. And that's why he pays, God rest his soul. Because from everybody I know that knew him said he was a gentleman and a great guy. But it's just another example of the Gambinos under the Gotti regime doing whatever the fuck they wanted to and having no regard for the fucking rules. And, you know, Borriello was in on the Castellano murder, so it's not like he was a saint either. Gigante looked past all of that. Casso had taken his shot. He had gotten his revenge. But we also had to take back go back a couple of more steps. In 1983, the feds had wiretaps on Ralph Scopo. On these tapes, it would show that Scopo was in fact shaking down construction contractors. At the time, you know, last week we discussed Scopo a bit, and he was a president of the Cement and Concrete Workers District Council of Labor's International Union of North America from 1977 till I believe April or May of 1985. I could be wrong about that. Scopo was largely responsible for the invention of the Concrete Club. As we said, the contract between $2 million and $15 million were reserved for the heads of the 5 families. Between 2 and 4% of those contracts were kicked back to the commission. Gennaro Angela would act on behalf of the Colombos. Tony Salerno would handle the Genovese part by using his sub-company, S&A Concrete Company and Transmix Concrete Company. Transmix Concrete Club. While the feds largely suspected that there were kickbacks, even though they had Scopo on wiretaps, it would be Tony Ducks Carollo who would bury the whole entire fucking commission with his big fucking mouth. A bug had been placed in the Jaguar of Tony Ducks, and the feds picked him up with Sal Alvolino, and they were discussing mafia business, gossip, and etc. It was from those wiretaps that the government learned about the commission, how it operated, and how each family was related to other families in terms of business. It would be enough for the feds to drop bombs, and bombs they did. On February 25th of 1985, Paul Castellano, Tony Salerno, Tony Ducks, Rusty Rastelli, Neil Della Croce, Jerry Langella, Salvatore Santoro, Christy Ticfunari, Ralph Scopo would be indicted. Following that indictment, Carmine Persco, Bruno Indelicato, and Stefano Canone would be indicted and arrested as well. The indictment named the heads of the 5 families and dropped charges such as loan shark and gambling, labor racketeering, extortion, and narcotics trafficking. They would all plead guilty not to them charges. A second set of racketeering charges would drop, and they would plead not guilty to those charges as well. Rusty Rastelli would be dropped from the case, and we'll talk about that in a second. Della Croce ends up dying, and Castellano would be whacked before that trial would even begin. Now, the reason why Rastelli's indictment was dropped was because the government learned that the Bonanos had been kicked off the commission as a result for the Donnie Brasco bullshit. He would be indicted later on in another racketeering case, but in this situation, the Bonanno crime family were left unscathed. What's very interesting about that is that they heard on wiretaps and they got information that Rusty Rastelli and the Bonanos weren't on the commission. But you'll see as we go on here that the Rudy Giuliani, that fucking Nosferatu-looking fucking weirdo with the shit streaks running down his face and head, knew that Tony Salerno wasn't the boss of the Genovese crime family. And we're going to talk about that too. But the evidence in this case was pretty much overwhelming. Carmine Persco pissed off all the other co-defendants by acting as his own lawyer. And perhaps one of the more interesting things was that Rudy Giuliani did offer them plea deals, but he wanted every single one of them to admit being in the mafia and to accept the stiffest of the charges, meaning they dropped the bullshit charges but forced them to plead guilty to the horrible ones. They would refuse, but they did admit, however, to being in the mafia after their lawyers told them, you're not going to have any shot unless you admit this. And that's what they did. The only one of the defendants who refused to even admit the mafia existed was Tony Salerno. Then allegedly acting boss or front boss of the Genovese crime family. One of the more interesting things is that Tony Salerno should have never been indicted to begin with. Not only was Salerno not the actual boss, but the government had tapes of Tony Salerno admitting he wasn't the boss. There was a tape that was played. Salerno was handed a list of men being proposed for membership, and Salerno says, I don't know any of these fucking names on this list. Send it up to the boss, let him deal with it. By that admission, he wasn't the boss, and he should have never been charged in that indictment to begin with. The Genovese crime family had insulated themselves so well, and even with Vinnie the Chin's nut job routine, the government didn't know who the fuck the boss was, but like I said, they fully knew that Salerno was not the boss because, and I'll tell you why in a second, but after 6 days of deliberations in this case, the jury convicted them on all 6 counts except Bruno Indelicato, who was facing murder charges of Carmine Gigante, and he would be found guilty of that. And I believe Bruno Indelicato is going to be getting out soon, if you can believe that. So here's a list and how it all worked out. Fat Tony Salerno was considered boss of the Genovese crime family. He got 100 years in prison and was fined $240,000. He died in 1992. Tony Dux Carollo, boss of the Lucchese crime family, 100 years in prison and fined $240,000. Died in 2000. Salvatore Tom Mick Santoro, underboss of the Lucchese crime family, 100 years in prison and fined $250,000. Gee, why add $10,000 fucking dollars? He died in January 2000. Christy Ticfunari, consigliere of the Lucchese crime family, 100 years in prison, $240,000 fine, died 2014. And he was actually released from prison. No, he was released in 2014, died in 2018. Carmine Persico, boss of the Colombo crime family, 100 years in prison, $240,000 fine, died in 2019. Gennaro Jerry Langella, acting boss or underboss of the Colombo crime family, 100 years in prison, $240,000 fine, died in September 2013. Ralph Scopo, soldier in the Colombo crime family, 100 years in prison, $240,000 fine, died in 1993. Anthony Bruno Indelicato, captain in the Bonanno crime family, 40 years in prison, fined $50,000, was released in 1998, was later rearrested in 2001. He's in Danbury, and I believe he's due to get out next year. So as you can see, everybody got 100 fucking years. But it's worth noting that right after this trial, Vincent the Fish Cafaro admitted under oath that Tony Salerno was not the boss. And in fact, Vinnie the Chin Gigante had been the acting boss since 1969. That not only would raise the antenna on Gigante, but the Genovese crime family in general. John Gotti would eventually get nabbed. He ends up going away, and that would make Vincent the Chin Gigante really the most powerful boss in the United States. As we said, Vinnie the Fish Cafaro admitted under oath and played the wiretap that they all knew Salerno wasn't the boss. Technically, Salerno at the time was indicted for something that he wasn't, but guess what? He took his fucking time, he shut his fucking mouth, and the rest is history. Stand-up fucking guy. In 1990, Vincent the Chin is indicted for bid rigging, which went back to the Windows racket. Gigante would arrive to trial in his pajamas and sit in a wheelchair. The defense would state again that just like they had done years before, that Gigante was fucking nuts. He was a schizophrenic. He was unfit to stand trial. And so for the next 7 years, Gigante was able to hold off that trial. He was so good at the act, the feds didn't really know what to believe. One of the reasons Gigante was so good at it is that he was fully willing to make himself look batshit crazy. The feds would come by his house. He'd get in the shower with his robe and a fucking umbrella. He also didn't leave his home without somebody being in the house. This way the feds couldn't sneak in and place a bug. He was smarter than a lot of other people, and he was smarter than the feds. In 1993, they would indict Gigante again, this time for sanctioning 6 murders and conspiring to kill another 3, including John Gotti. Sanity hearings would begin in 1996. Sammy the Rat Gravano, Little Al Diarco, and Phil Leonetti would testify that Gigante was in fact lucid and the boss of the Genovese crime family. In defense, the attorneys for Gigante would produce psych exams from 1969 through 1995 and would even have psychiatrists come on the stand to speak towards Gigante's insanity. They explained that Gigante suffered from debilitating mental illnesses and had been committed some 28 times to hospitals and mental wards for treatment of hallucinations, schizophrenia, and brain damage. It would take 6 years before a judge could even make a decision on this. Gigante had played them, and he had played the system and kept himself out long enough to put his family in order and keep the machine moving. He knew what was coming down the pike, and it gave him time to kind of put shit in order. In August of 1996, Judge Eugene Nickerson ruled that Gigante was mentally fit to stand trial. Gigante had originally pled not guilty and was out on $1 million bail, but in December, Gigante would have a heart operation in 1996, and then shortly after, they would begin his trial. He would show up drooling on himself, looking spaced out, muttering incoherently in a wheelchair. On July 25th of 1997, Gigante would be found guilty of conspiring to kill 3 men and running criminal rackets as the boss of the Genovese crime family. After the case, prosecutors stated that the conviction proved that Gigante was, in fact, not mentally ill. Gigante would be sentenced to 12 years in prison and was slapped with a $1.25 million fine. Gigante would head to prison, where he would continue to run his crime family. While he was absent, he would allow a panel to pretty much handle business, that being Barney Bellomo, Dom Cirillo, and Matty Ianello. But that would sort of switch a bit as Barney Bellomo would end up heading to prison in 1996. Cirillo would end up having a heart attack and call it a career, and Matty Ianello gets indicted in 2005 and actually resigns. Gigante would send orders through his son Andrew, who was allowed to visit him in prison. So he was using his son as a proxy message sender. In 2002, Gigante is indicted with others, including his son Andrew. They get charged with obstruction of justice for delaying the trial for 7 years with his Nut Act. Andrew would drop bail to somewhere in the tune of $2.5 to $3 million. And the feds had plans of playing tapes of Gigante acting very normal. They also sat down with Gigante and they explained to him that they're going to charge all of his sons, they're going to charge his cousins, his brothers with obstruction, because they all knew he wasn't fucking nuts. So they were going to bankrupt him and throw every single member of his family into prison. That was what they were going to do. Unless Gigante played ball with them. And I think Gigante, looking at things, I don't think he wanted to give up the Nut Act, but I think he only did because his family was more important to him than the Nut Act. He already knew he was going to serve 12 years. He knew he was going to get, another couple of years for this. Let me get my family the fuck out of this. And that's exactly what he does. He admits that it was all fucking an act. And he ends up pleading guilty, and he gets sentenced to 3 more years, which would have carried it to 15 years in prison. He would probably done 8.5 and gotten out. And had he lived, he would have actually gotten out. And a part of that agreement was, he said that if I plead guilty to this, you're going to leave my family alone, and I don't want my son to get prison time. And they says, yeah. That's what they promised, but that's not what they did. What they turn around, he pleads guilty and they hammer him. He gets sentenced to 3 years in prison and $2.5 million fine. Gigante had played the system for some 30 fucking years, and had a run of boss from 1969 until 2005. In 2005, Gigante passes away at the Medical Center for Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. According to law enforcement, allegedly, Barney Bellomo was named the boss of the Genovese crime family in 2005 and has been ever since. The Genovese crime family still uses a front boss structure today to insulate themselves. Some things never change. By many accounts, Barney Bellomo is much like his predecessors. He's quiet, he's low-key, he keeps it about business, and you're not going to see him on the streets. The Genovese crime family is the most powerful crime family in the United States. I believe them to be more powerful than the Gambinos. They're much more secretive, I think, than the Gambino crime family is. Historically, when we look back at Vincent Gigante, from his beginnings as a boxer to the botched hit on Frank Costello, he played his cards right. He was loyal to Vito Genovese, which, one may argue he didn't need to be, because Vito Genovese certainly really wasn't loyal to really anybody else but Vinnie the Chin, historically speaking. But this is a guy who did what he was told, did what his boss said, and took his time and then ascended the throne and held on to it for a ton of fucking time. 69 to 2005. He was the boss of the Genovese crime family. And they weren't able to get shit on him until the end. Yeah, he got fucked by Carlo Gambino, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello in the heroin thing. But he gets out in 7 years, continues business as usual, and rises up through the ranks. You would be hard pressed. And I know people like to make fun of him because he fucking wore a robe and pissed himself and did crazy shit. But he did what he had to do, and it kept him off the radar. They did not know until 96. Well, I think they knew that Salerno wasn't the boss, but they didn't know that Vinnie Gigante was the boss. They didn't know till 96 that he was the boss. So from 69 to 96, nobody knew it was him. That's the way you run a crime family. So when we talk about historical implications, you got to look at mob bosses that insulate themselves, keep it quiet, keep it low key, don't make waves. You can make fun of them till the cows come home about walking Houston in a bathrobe. John Gotti had a 5-year run, 69 to 96, unimpeded. And then from 96 to like 2001, unimpeded. Do you have any bearing on how much money that guy made? And we've talked about Tony Salerno and how creative he was and how much money he was worth just on his own. Billions. If you're looking for a mold, if you're looking for a way to look at a mob family and how they should be run, for me, it doesn't get any better than Vinnie Gigante. It really doesn't. What he was able to do for so fucking long. And he was involved in some of the mob history stuff we talk about. And so, yeah, I know people like John Gotti and I know people, are fans of him. But I'm asking you to look at this from an objective area without dogging either one of them, because for every positive, there's always a negative with everybody. But this is a guy from 69 to 96. That is a ton of fucking time. They didn't have the rat problems the Gambinos did. They didn't, it just, and maybe it's unfair to like judge, but I'm going to tell you this, and this is, a lot of people will tell you this too. They'll agree with me. If John Gotti doesn't kill Paul Castellano, he's never boss of the Gambino crime family. John Gotti also doesn't get on the cover of Time magazine if he doesn't whack Paul Castellano. I just don't think he would have rose the ranks, because I think there were other people ahead of him that were brighter and at least had the idea of keeping it a little more low key. But I'm not John Gotti. I didn't live in his shoes. The guy was a gangster straight through and through, and I don't want people to think I dislike him or don't like him. But I think the one thing that I do that a lot of people won't do is I'm honest about it. If you're going to categorize somebody and you're going to talk about them in the annals of crime history, Ray Patriarca, 20-some years. Joey Merlino, 20-some years. Russell Buffalino, 30-some fucking years. Carlos Marcello, 30 fucking years. Santo Trafficante, 30 fucking years. How many of those guys died in prison? That's, yeah, and I know the Gigante died in prison, but he spent the majority of his criminal career not in prison. Ray Patriarca, same deal, died in his own. Buffalino died at home. Gambino died at home. Marcello died at home. Are you noticing a trend? And it's not to compare and contrast, but I think that if you're going to look objectively at organized crime, guy that has a 5-year run is nothing. Guy that has a 30-year run, that says something. But you know what? I think the Mafia could have used more people like John Gotti in terms of toughness and bravado, but ultimately it came back to bite him in the ass. So I don't want people thinking I'm just dogging the guy, because that's really not what I'm doing. We're comparing two different people, and whether or not people agree with me that that's fair or not, I think I can. So that is the history of the Genovese crime family.